97.7 FM, the sound of the Southeast.
Welcome to Viewpoints, listeners. I'm your host, Henry Grossek. It's been a great pleasure to welcome regular guest to our Viewpoints podcast, Dr. David Roy, lecturer in the School of Education at the University of Newcastle in New South Wales. Welcome again to Viewpoints, Dr. David Roy.
As always, Henry, it is a pleasure to be on the show and speaking to people in Victoria.
Absolutely, and it's as our audience indicates, it's you bring them a lot of pleasure and insights with your conversations that we have, and so it's an honour to have you on our program. And look, we'll get straight into it. There's a Royal Commission that's handing down its findings, and it'd be quite, I think, accurate to say, and it wouldn't be an understatement to say that it's already caused a lot of interest, if not controversy. You might like to, this is on the disability sector, you might like to tell us a little bit about what they've been looking at and why it's so controversial.
Well, it's interesting. It's a wide-ranging Royal Commission into the treatment of people with a disability across Australia. So it's covered multiple areas to do with housing, to do with group homes, employment, the treatment and medical services, and also education. And it is probably, as well as the idea of the housing for people with a disability and the employment, which have been really key because they are treated differently, almost slave-like, cruel conditions. The one that, of course, that has been the focus for me has been education. And as many commentators have talked about, that the social housing and employment actually comes from the education, because if we start segregating people with the disability from childhood, that isolation in the community and that treatment of them as lesser continues all the way through their life to how they are housed, how they are employed or not employed. So it's been quite challenging because the Royal Commission has challenged some of the things that we do in society, and even some of the commissioners have not been in agreement. The most controversial issue is probably to do with the way that we sometimes have separate schools for specific purpose, which are segregated settings, and that can be seen as a pejorative word, but they are different schools purely for the disabled. And one of the interesting things from the Commission is those commissioners who either have a disability or who have lived experience of family members with disability said these are bad things for society and need to be shut, while the able-bodied commissioners said, we're not quite sure there's such a big problem. And that maybe sums up a lot of what's been happening in Australia, is the fact that it is the voices of others rather than those affected that have been saying the system's okay. And I guess we can apply this across the way for the voice and for lots of other things in society, and for maybe the treatment of women, is the fact that I tend to listen to the voice of those people affected to say, what do you need? What do you think is the best way? So that's been the controversy, I guess.
And in looking at potential outcomes, there's been from the stakeholders out there, different stakeholders have different viewpoints as to how we should move forward in it too.
Yeah, and it's not a simple solution. It's nuanced because, as I would argue, that the ideal would be for all children to be able to be taught together, so that disabled and non-disabled children are intermixing together, so that carries on as they become adults in society. However, the way that we run schools, the way the systems run, the way we assess, the way that we fund, the way that we resource with teachers as well as within the actual buildings, is not made to incorporate inclusion for children with a disability and the wide umbrella of types of disabilities. So if we want to have inclusion, we actually need to change everything. So that's the problem. People don't like change. And they say, well, if it's working for the majority, is it all right for a minority to have a lesser outcome? I would say in a mature adult society, it's not. But it also means this can't be changed overnight, that this is going to have to be a long, gradual process. We're going to have to change buildings. We're going to have to change the way that we staff schools. And we already have a shortage of staff, and we're going to need double the numbers. We're going to have to change attitudes and expectations. So it's not an easy fix, but it is able to be done It just takes a will politically and resourceful-wise.
Yes, look, I'm on the inside of the system and clearly have some experience over a considerable length of career with the issue of the inclusion of students in schools. And look, I think you hit the nail on the head. If it's going to work, it's going to take time, and it's going to take an awful lot of hard work and resources. And the other part of it is that'll come only with the public coming on board and being prepared to commit a lot of money to those changes. So there's an argument there that needs to be won at the beginning, or else we will end up with an outcome that doesn't satisfy anybody.
Yeah, but one of the big things for me is that we can throw lots of money at things. We have thrown so much money at closing the gap, and it hasn't happened because there hasn't been an attitudinal change or control. But for me, in the education one, the biggest change that we have to have is society's view of the status of education and the role of teachers, and a desire to recreate teaching as one of the go-to places of employment. When I was a young kid, okay, so we're talking in the 70s into the 80s, teaching still was seen as, at least when I grew up in Scotland, as an aspirational career. Teachers were seen as pillars of the community to be respected. We didn't have justice of the peace in Scotland. When you needed a document signed or a passport document, you went to one of three people. You went to a lawyer, you went to a religious minister, or you went to a teacher, because those were the three kind of respectable, honest trades, as it were. And we have lost that. So we need to reframe what teaching is, what it can be, and that also means changing the way that we treat teachers in the classroom. So there's a whole pile of societal change for this to work, has to happen.
Look, one of the things, and this is the discourse among people in the teaching profession. I'm talking here public schools at the moment, because that's my greater experience, is at the moment, and this is where part of the shift will have to be, the way schools are resourced and the way people are trained, or let's put it more bluntly, not trained well enough. That's from the aides through to the teachers to the leadership to understand and work with children with severe disabilities. At the moment, the lack there, and the resourcing and the whole thing. There's a reluctance of people to say, gee whiz, we're going to embrace this because already our work is incredibly stressful. We don't believe we've got the resources, blah, 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 blah. And how is this going to make teaching more attractive, given how we currently see the scenario?
That's exactly the problem. I have to say, one of the things that Victoria has just done that I think is going to start to make that dripping change is they've actually just announced that teaching degrees will have a HECS debt paid. So they will actually cover the cost of a teaching degree. So as soon as you remove a $30,000 to $40,000 to $50,000 fee to become trained as a teacher, that makes it a much more attractive prospect for employment. So that's one way to go forward. I wish all the states would do this.
That's one. Of course, the another one, and here's one from left field that we often look at, and it's much broader than the disability inclusion. But I'd be being disingenuous if I didn't say to you, David, that a lot of people in public schools look across at the independent school sector. And the perception many of us hold is that when the going gets tough with some of these kids, and I say it's a perception that is held, and it's held reasonably widely, the independent schools don't take anywhere near as many of the children with disabilities, severe disabilities, as the public school system does. And if we're going to have a truly inclusive society where we're all on the same page, so to speak, then surely an education system in its entirety, which is the private schools are subsidised by taxpayers' money, that they embrace this in the way that we will be embracing it, because what people fear is that this will become the almost total responsibility of the public system, not including the private system.
I absolutely agree. And there's a couple of things that make this Royal Commission quite interesting in that way. There's one recommendation that was the first recommendation, and it's not specific about education, but it's an overarching one, which is that they need to create a Disability Rights Act. Now, we have the Disability Discrimination Act, which is reactive, which after the event you can say, oh, you were discriminating, it wasn't equal, but that maintains system. A Rights Act would mean that actually all systems have to show why they are denying things, and that would include independent systems and Catholic systems. So they could then be challenged if they are not, or they are refusing enrolment of children with a disability, because that should not be a barrier to enrolling in any school. So that's why that legislation, if it gets made, could make a fundamental difference to that. Because I have noted that there are some independent schools, and there are a very small number of these, I'm sad to say, but they have been created as an ethos to try to include disability as well as mainstream. And I guess it's due to maybe the ethos of the creation of that school. They often do have some kind of social justice kind of religion base within them. They actually do it really successfully, and they get the funding for it. So it can be done, and there's some public schools that do it excellently as well. So we know it can be done, and a lot of it's down to the attitude and if they get the right support in the community. But yes, I fully agree that if we're going to make this inclusive, then people should not be allowed to banish certain children purely because of their disability. They wouldn't be allowed to do it based on race. They shouldn't be allowed to do it based on gender. Neither should they be allowed to do it based on disability.
What's your position on because what we've got are different opinions on the duration that should be there for the movement towards inclusion. That is, some people are suggesting, I think one figure that's suggested is 30 years to get there and get there completely. And that's the absolutist view, but is the 30 years negotiable? And the other one, of course, is should all special setting schools be closed, and should it be the one system for every child, or would there still be provision? And I think that's one of the talking points. Or should there be some children for whom the mainstream just may not work?
Well, I think that's why it has to be a gradual process. The 30-year kind of lead time that has been suggested by half of the commissioners, the others didn't give any lead time at all. They just said at some point it should happen. And Jordan Steele, the senator, said actually we should be doing this in 10 years or less. It's a problem. 30 years means you've got 2 generations of children who are being segregated still. However, we cannot do this immediately. So I think the idea that we don't have any more SSPs is a good idea, that we have enough, that we should be slowly moving towards integration. Whether we get rid of them all, and sorry for those listening at home, SSP is a school for a specific purpose, as in teaching children with a disability. I think SSP for disability, we should be able to phase out. Behaviour is a different matter, because behaviour is something that can be modified. You cannot modify someone's disability. So if you're saying they're being put into an SSP for disability, that's in there for life, because their disability won't change. Behaviour is something that can be changed and worked on and supported. So I have no issue with SSPs for children with behaviour to help them become reintegrated into the mainstream. But yeah, I do think we should be slowly moving towards a fully inclusive system, because until we have an inclusive education system, we'll never have an inclusive society, and we will always have a lower class, a lesser human being viewed in society as well. The timescale, I think we should set a deadline. Whether we meet that, I don't think we can say if we will. But if we don't have an aspirational goal, if we don't have hope, and hope is something you and I have talked about, if we have hope for change, then we'll never actually achieve it. But as long as we just keep making SSPs, there will never be any motivation within the education system to make fundamental change that can benefit everybody, not just children with disability, but every child in the school system.
Now, looking at it from a completely different perspective, as part of this cultural change as much as physical change in terms of what we provide in the way of school settings with students, I'll throw one at you. There'll need to be a significant change in what's currently, and governments would have to change their view on this one, I'd say, David, and that is how we rank what we call great schools and good schools, because at the moment, VCE or its equivalent and NAPLAN are, to a large extent, the holy grail of school achievement. Now, clearly, there are children for whom the top of the range NAPLAN results or VCE results would be beyond their reach with, let's say, severe intellectual disability. So if we're going to stick with that system, that's going to be that's going to depress the schools, and there's some of them around at the moment that are doing great things in well-being and or disabilities, because it doesn't get up there as an outstanding school, and that puts pressure on schools, and parents read these things and go, oh, that's a great school, blah blah blah. Now there'll have to be a shift there in what we value in terms of school achievement.
Absolutely, and it's down to what we assess and what we value. Also says a lot about the society. I'm always much more interested, rather than what's the NAPLAN result, is to see what is actually the student's growth. Is the student growing academically and also emotionally, and just in basic skills for society? Is there an add-on each year? If there is an add-on each year, then that school's doing something right. If there is a stagnation, that there is no growth happening for children, then that school's has got to rethink what it's doing. But I would never lambast a school and say, well, that's a bad school. What it just means is that school needs to change its approach, because its individual cohort has different needs. All different kids have different needs. They have different aspects that need to grow. And I think NAPLAN can be a useful tool, but it should only be one of a multitude. And it should be for the teachers and the school to use to say, okay, so our kids are doing quite well in reading, but they're not doing that well in comprehension. So we need to maybe think about how do we support comprehension for certain pupils in the classroom. And even then, it's about individual kids. So is there a growth for that child? Do we know why there hasn't been? Because it might be factors outside of the school's control. For instance, a child who is caught within a family that has domestic violence or has had loss, and that child is probably going to have educational barrier happening to them because of other factors outside. So we've got to think again about the individuals, and that's a rethink about the way that we value learning, that we value what the whole school brings to the community.
And wouldn't that also be, by extension, exactly the same thing that would need to happen with our tertiary institutions, where ATAR scores predominantly are the holy grail of entry?
Yes, absolutely. And we need to rethink about how we're creating barriers to education in the tertiary sector, and also thinking about where we're trying to push kids in. I think there's been a massive push to get kids in to go to university. That has been at the cost of TAFE at the apprentice colleges where they're actually learning the skills, which is why we have a shortage of electricians and plumbers and masonry, skilled craftsmen, all those roles. That is a really viable and valuable aspect of learning in the community, and we need to revalue those skills as well. We've gone down much more the kind of the Socratic, division of labour averse academia, and sometimes academia is not the be all and end all. I'm an academic saying that.
Of course, some academics would have a vested interest in wanting that to continue because as student numbers, you're tied to them on finance and funding as much as the school system is.
Which is what the problem is. We have monetized it. We have made it all about the finance rather than about the learning.
Absolutely, David. We could have gone on and on and on. Look, it's an issue that at least we've had a Royal Commission. It's on the table. I don't think we're going to finalise this for some years. There needs to be some good discussion. Again, you don't want it to be moved to the never never. But is this Royal Commission, in your opinion, hopeful? Using the word we often talk about, is it a hopeful starting point?
It is a hopeful starting point. The federal government is looking at it to see what they're going to say about the recommendations because they have to accept them. They won't have done that until the early 2014. And of course, many of the recommendations don't affect just federal government, but they affect each of the state governments. So there's going to be a whole lot of soul searching going on by governments, and let's find out what they actually accept and say they will implement, and then we can hold them to account for what has to be done.
And as an expatriate from Scotland, you would understand the federal system that we have. And I've done a little bit of quick reading across the states, and there are some commonalities in the early comments from the different state governments, but there's also quite a disparity in their early announcements on how they're viewing the findings. So we would really, for this to work, we'd need all the states pretty much on the same page, wouldn't we?
It does, and I guess it'll be interesting to see if that happens, given that the majority of the states, and maybe quite soon in Tasmania, given recent political events, all the states and territories might eventually have one political party running them all. That could allow for commonality, but again, you never know what New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland are going to do because they're just always wanting to one-up each other.
I know, and let's hope partisan politics can be put aside for this most important issue. David, as always, a wonderful opportunity to share ideas and talk about important issues. And really, this is a centre of the front page issue, and one that needs to be dealt with in a way that builds a much more inclusive society.
Yeah, listen, Henry, always a pleasure to speak with you and to share with your listeners. So thank you for the opportunity once again.
Thank you. That was Dr. David Roy, who's a lecturer at the University of Newcastle in New South Wales. Yes, a most important topic, that of disability inclusion in our schooling system.
When selling your